Right, hello everybody. We're going to kick off. Thanks so much for coming. I'm your host, Sophie. I work at NEF. Welcome to my living room and to all your living rooms. So let's make a start. Welcome to the second weekly economics briefing, this time on fixing the social safety net. Thanks for joining us this week, and thanks if you joined us last week. Like I said, my name's Sophie. I work for NEF in the comms department. For anyone new joining us, the New Economics Foundation, or NEF, is a think tank working to build an economy that works for both people and planet. Let's see how many people there are. It's great to have 100 of you with us tonight on this call. Welcome to everybody. Please do introduce yourself to us and where you're calling in from in the chat box. Some of you have already done that. Thank you very much. We want as many people as possible to hear about these briefings, so please tweet with the hashtag NEFbriefing to help spread the word. These briefings will take place every Thursday evening from 7 till 8 o'clock BST, so please do keep this time free. You can already sign up to next week's briefing, which is on coronavirus, renters and homelessness. We'll be sharing a link for this in the chat. So last week we heard an amazing array of speakers discussing what the coronavirus means for the economy. If you missed the briefing, don't worry, we recorded it and we'll share a link for that as well for you to watch after we finish this evening. If you've got the stamina, it doesn't have to be tonight, you can watch it at your leisure. This week we'll be taking a deeper dive into what the coronavirus crisis has meant for the social safety net. Over the past few weeks, we've seen over 1 million people sign on for universal credit. Many more have been stuck in an online queue. This is a grim result of an 8-fold increase in unemployment statistics. As many people are laid off by their employers and others furloughed and a loss of hours. To support workers through this difficult time, the government has introduced an unprecedented, can't say that, it is a word being used quite often at the moment, unprecedented job retention scheme, including an 80% income guarantee for those employed, up to £2,500 a month. Whilst this is a welcome relief for lots of workers, many are still left wanting. What kinds of emergency measures should we be putting into place to make sure no one is falling through the gaps? How might this map onto a broader plan for a better social security system in the future? And what can we learn from how these initial demands were won to build a more robust safety net in the future? To talk us through this and more, we have 3 amazing speakers on the call this evening. First, we'll hear from Sarah Arnold, who is a senior economist at NEF. Sarah will talk about why the social safety net has been eroded and some of the ideas for measures we could be putting in place to strengthen it. Then we'll be hearing from Laurie Macfarlane, who's the economics editor at openDemocracy. He's also a NEF fellow. Thanks very much, Laurie, for being here. Who has very kindly offered to stand in for Caroline Malloy this evening. Laurie will talk about how these emergency measures could fit within a bigger picture of the economy as a whole. And finally, we will hear from Kate Bell, Head of Rights, International Social and Economics at the TUC, the Trades Union Congress. Hello to you, Kate. Kate will talk about how the job retention scheme introduced by the government was won through negotiation with trade unions and what lessons we can learn for winning further demands. As with last week, the speakers will talk one after the other. As they are speaking, please write any questions you have in the chat box and we will do our best to put them to the speakers. We've got a little bit more time this week on our call, so hopefully we'll be able to get through a few more questions than we did last week. However, we will obviously not have time to answer all the questions, so we really do apologise in advance if we don't get round to your question this time. Finally, this is only our second ever mass Zoom call. We're still working things out, so please bear with us if there are any technical glitches or I can't pronounce words, which is happening more often than I was expecting. So without further ado, let's hear from our first speaker, who is Sarah Arnold, Senior Economist at NEF. Hello, Sarah, are you there? Yes, you are. Hello, Sarah, and welcome to the call. Are you there? Hello. Yeah. Can you talk us through how the social safety net has been eroded and what changes you think we should be pushing for now?
Sure. Hi, everyone. So firstly, I just wanted to take a step back and say this is obviously an incredibly difficult and stressful time for everyone. But just as some people are more at risk from the coronavirus than others, some are more financially vulnerable than others to the necessary lockdown and social distancing measures we need to undertake to keep people as safe as possible during this time. So as Sophie said, the government's package of support for firms and workers during this crisis has been completely unprecedented. And in particular, the government has effectively committed to guaranteeing the livelihoods of millions of workers. But millions more will not be able to access the government's job retention schemes, and they'll have to rely on our inadequate social security system. The majority having to rely on universal credit, which is unfit for purpose. And as those who kind of have been claiming it before the crisis already know, it will not protect people from economic hardship. So the government's trying to respond by continuing to extend the job retention schemes piecemeal to as many people as possible, but it will never be able to cover everybody. Over 1.5 million people have made claims to universal credit and other legacy benefits over the last 4 weeks, and this is likely just the tip of the iceberg. We've estimated that over 5.5 million people are at high risk of losing their jobs or hours and being unable to access the job retention scheme, which is roughly 1 in 6 people who are working in January, our most recent statistics. And these are including those who are made redundant rather than furloughed, and people like the recently self-employed who miss out on these schemes. And of course, the rest of the self-employed people who even are eligible for schemes will have to wait till June. So this has effectively created a 2-tier system where those covered under the government schemes will have the majority of their income protected, and others are left with a fraction of what they need to live. So just as the government has put in place an income guarantee for those remaining in employment, it needs an income guarantee for everyone else not covered by the scheme. And I'll talk a little bit about what we think that should look like in a minute. But first, I'll just talk a bit about why the social security system that we have is woefully inadequate. And there are 2 main reasons. The first is that it's highly ungenerous. It's just not enough for the majority of people to live on. And welfare support for the working age has been significantly eroded over the last decade. We've seen about £34 billion being cut from the budget, and cuts have been particularly targeted towards working age people. And we've seen a corresponding rise in food banks and other emergency support during this period, making clear that the cuts have caused enormous economic hardship for many. Now, since the start of the crisis, the government has increased payments for under universal credit and working tax credits by £20 per week. But this only amounts to about 1/5 of the cuts since 2010. And we still have one of the least generous social security systems in Europe. So now the main adult element of universal credit is around £94 per week for the over 25s, or less than that if you're under 25. And there's therefore a huge divide between the protection people have under the job retention scheme versus those who access the social security system. So a single person earning minimum wage will have 31% of their net income covered under universal credit if they lose their job, which contrasts with about 84% of their income covered under the job retention scheme. And this 2-tier system does not seem fair at all. And second, the way that the system works is not at all fit for purpose, and the system simply can't cope with this level of demand. Firstly, those applying now will have to wait a minimum of 5 weeks for the payment, which is how it's set up, in part due to kind of stringent conditionality and means testing. And this 5-week wait is a minimum. With a report on universal credit by the NAO found that 1 in 5 people had to wait longer than those 5 weeks. And the system requires a manual trigger for the payment, which is particularly problematic right now, given the system is completely flooded and unable to cope with the demand. There's just not enough people administering the system to do that. Now, in the meantime, you can get an advance payment, but this is a loan. It will need to be paid back out of future payments within 12 months and can significantly diminish the actual payments you get from universal credit, which can cause further hardship. So the idea behind the minimum income guarantee is a policy to strengthen the social security system to ensure, firstly, that it's more generous, less conditional, and available quickly, and to basically create an equivalent income guarantee to the government's job retention system, which provides an income guarantee for those protected. So it would be a cash payment available to anyone who applies, and administered through the existing social security system, as we think that is the quickest way, without requiring new systems to be set up, to make sure it's available to all who need it. So it should be much more generous to actually cover the basics people need to live. So we suggest this might look something around £200 a week, excluding rent. This is roughly doubling the main element of the existing benefits, based on research by the Joseph Rowntree Foundation and separate research by the Citizens Advice Bureau into the minimum income people actually need to cover their basics. New claimants of any age, including the under 25, should get this, but also the main elements of key benefits of existing claimants should be immediately uplifted, so everybody receives this amount. And additional elements on top of that, such as support for carers, should also be preserved. It should also be available to all who need it. Unlike the current system, which is quite conditional, and for example, it's not available to migrants with no recourse to public funds, and certain benefits are only available to those who have contributed to through national insurance contributions for a certain period of time. So this would be available to absolutely anyone who applied for it. You could even apply for it if you're eligible for other government schemes, particularly, for example, the self-employed might need it to tide them over until June, when the scheme will open. But once you did access these other schemes, it would be deducted, would be the idea. And finally, it should be available to people quickly, without a cumbersome application process or a long wait. So that means we need to remove upfront means testing. New applicants should simply get this amount and it should be automatically provided. We suggest using one way of doing this could be using the advanced payment facility under Universal Credit, which takes up to 5 days currently, but that's partly as a result of means testing, so it would be quicker than that. As anyone could apply for it, even those on higher incomes, we have potentially suggested that if you subsequently earn over a certain threshold over the next tax year, maybe the median income or the £30,000 threshold that's a cut off for other government schemes, you could be asked to pay some of it back through a tapered way, but over a long time period, so it doesn't itself become a burden. So that's kind of the proposal is we've set out. We think that this minimum income guarantee, or something that looks quite like it, at a level sufficient to prevent economic hardship and available to all that need it and quickly, is absolutely vital to ensure that everyone is protected from economic hardship during this public health and economic crisis. But we also see it as a first step in strengthening the social security system, making it much more generous and less conditional, so it can be fit for purpose and provide a safety net, the adequate safety net that we need for people to keep the economy going now, throughout the recovery, and beyond. That was kind of, I guess I'll stop there because I don't want to go over time.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Sarah. That was such a useful starting point for our discussion. Just to say to everyone, if you are looking for some further information about what Sarah is talking about, including on the minimum income guarantee, then check out the podcast we recorded, which has more details in it, where Sarah talks through all of those ideas, or Sarah's most recent blog post. We're posting the link for both in the chat now. So we had a couple of follow-up questions over email and in the chat, some of which touches on UBI, Sarah, and that links to some of what our head of economics, Alfie Sterling, talked about in last week's briefing. So how does a minimum income guarantee differ from UBI? Is this not a chance for UBI at the moment? And if we do something, either minimum income or UBI, is that something we can afford to do?
Okay, that was quite a few questions. I'll take the first one first. So whether this is a UBI or not, I think there's not a single UBI proposal. There are several different UBI proposals, so it's a bit hard to say, but I think the core of what most people consider to be a universal basic income is a non-conditional cash payment available to all. And we'd support any proposal that seeks to do this. So I think this is is pretty similar. The question then, however, becomes how you do that. A key question you could ask, I suppose, is why make people apply for it? Why not just give it to everybody? And I can see the sense in that, because by asking people to apply for it, we'll need to kind of also have a massive public information campaign to make sure that everyone knows their rights to apply and has the resources to do so. But just giving it to everyone comes with many problems as well, particularly because the government just doesn't have everybody's details. It doesn't really have anyone's details. That's why partly the job retention scheme is being paid through employers. This is not insurmountable, but we're proposing something like this because we think it would be quicker. But for me, the priority is, as you've said, is trying to put something in place which is not reversible. And very few people are thinking things like the job retention scheme will last beyond the lockdown. And having something new is also makes it much easier to kind of reverse once and to be considered temporary. So that's why we're proposing to strengthen the generosity and reduce the conditionality of the existing social security system, which will last beyond this crisis, which seems to me much harder to reverse than a payment, the kind of a one-off corona response that something else could be presented. But we also think like it's really important for the sector to come together, and for everybody who thinks that we need a much more generous safety net to come together, and we need to work together to kind of come up with a proposal that everyone can all get behind. So we are keen to kind of continue developing these ideas. And then in terms of affordability, the short answer is yes, we can afford it. And I would say we cannot afford not to. I think this crisis has made it clear how dependent we are upon each other. And just as we socialise the costs of the lockdown for those protected under the government's, under the job retention scheme, by the government just basically backing that up. We need to do this for everybody, not just for some. And we estimate that this will cost something in the region of about 15 billion to cover maybe everybody who's already needed to access a social security system, up to maybe about 30 billion pounds, which is what it would need to cover all those at risk, as I said. Which puts it in about the same ballpark as other schemes. So the government's job retention scheme will cost about 40 billion pounds, and the self-employed scheme support will be about 10 billion. And the deficit's already forecast to widen to 200 billion. So this is relatively marginal. But the key point here is that right now no one really thinks that we have an affordability crisis. Long-term government borrowing costs are incredibly cheap right now, and are likely to remain so due to coordination with the Bank of England. And there's a huge demand for that government borrowing from people, from investors who consider this to be a safer investment than nearly anything else. So yes, I think we can afford it, and we can't really afford not to.
Thanks, Sarah. That was fantastic, a fantastic overview and a fantastic answer to that question. We look forward to hearing more about some of these ideas in the future. On that note, if you are excited by some of the ideas that Sarah has talked about, then we want to hear from you. NEF is interested in running a campaign to adopt a minimum income guarantee, and we need your support. So if you'd be interested in taking action in a campaign for a minimum income guarantee, then please fill out the Google form that we are sharing in the chat right now. Thank you very much. And just a reminder before we move on to post any questions in the chat while the speakers are talking, and we will do our best to get that to them. Right, let's move on then to our second speaker, Laurie Macfarlane, Economics Editor at openDemocracy and NEF Fellow. Laurie, thanks for joining the call this evening. Can you hear me?
Yes. Hello.
All the way from Scotland. Technology is wonderful. So thanks very much for joining us. All of the measures to fix a social safety net, like all of the measures we've talked about, all the measures we've seen, they will all involve pumping money into the economy. But you're worried this money might not end up where it's needed most, I've heard, on the grapevine. Could you talk us through that a little bit?
Yeah, and firstly, hello everyone. Thanks very much for having me. It's great to be able to be part of this discussion. Firstly, I would just echo the points made by Sarah in the sense that openDemocracy has also been running a campaign calling on the government to introduce a livable income guarantee, which in practice is very similar to what Sarah just talked about. We've got a petition, and we've also been gathering testimonials from people at the sharp end who've really been left out from the measures introduced so far. So we do think it's absolutely critical that the government does go further, providing income to those who are desperately needed at this time. But I also think it's important to be thinking and talking about the bigger picture here, because what we're seeing at the moment is the government spending vast amounts of money, levels that we, relatively unprecedented. So we need to be thinking about who's ultimately going to benefit from this money and where the cost of that's ultimately going to fall. And this is even the case, it's actually more important if we're successful in persuading the government to introduce something like an income guarantee, because it means we'll be spending more money. And I think a useful starting point here to think about this is to think about how the pandemic has impacted the flow of money through the economy. So in normal times, the engine of the economy in this country is household spending. So some of this spending is on essential things like rent, like mortgage payments, like utilities and food. And the rest of it is on discretionary things like restaurants, bars, holidays, all this kind of stuff. And crucially, the richer, the higher income households spend much more on the discretionary stuff than the low income households. Low income households, basically most of their spending is on the essential stuff. And because one person's spending is another person's income, all of this spending that households usually do is what generates revenues for businesses, and they then pay their workers in wages. And then an economy like the UK, which is very unequal, and where business and landlords have much more bargaining power than workers, a lot of the money that ordinary people earn actually ends up flowing out straight away in things like rent, mortgages, bills. So it goes straight into the pockets of landlords, of banks and things like that. And obviously in turn, the people who receive that, the landlords, the bank owners, etc., then use that to then go and spend on their restaurants and holidays and things, and the cycle continues. So if we think about how the pandemic has impacted this, spending on essentials has really been maintained. People still need to eat, people still need to put a roof over their head, etc. What's changed and what's really caused at the root of the downturn here is that discretionary spending has collapsed. So people aren't going to restaurants, people aren't going to bars, people aren't doing all this kind of stuff because they can't, because they have to stay at home. And this has led to a collapse in business income, which means that many companies can't afford to pay their workers' wages anymore. Now, in order to stop this from happening, and basically in order to stop widespread unemployment, businesses just laying people off left, right and centre, which incidentally is what's happened in the US, we've seen unemployment go through the roof. Governments and central banks have stepped in, rightly, in my view, to plug this income gap through things like the job retention scheme, so furloughing employees and paying up to 80% of their wages. And ideally, in our view, they should also be introducing an income guarantee. But it's important to think, well, who loses and who wins from this overall? So even if you are lucky and you qualify for the furlough scheme, you're only being compensated for 80% of your wages. And actually, there's many people, as Sarah outlined, who aren't that lucky and who've been left on universal credit or only on £94 a week. But for many people, as I already said, this money will largely be going straight out the door on things like rent, on things like mortgage payments, on things like bills, on things like debt repayments. And so the flip side of this, if you think about it, is that the income streams for asset owners, so landlords and banks, etc., are being protected. So because we've managed to prop up incomes, that means that these income flows to asset owners is being protected. And it's important to also mention here that actually for many people at the higher end of the income distribution, because their incomes are being, in many cases, maintained. For example, if you're a landlord, for example, you have a portfolio of properties, your income's being maintained, but your spending has really collapsed because you can't spend money. And so some people at the higher end are actually seeing their bank balances increase quite significantly right now. One of someone I know got in touch who was in exactly that position and said, yeah, I mean, I can't spend money, but my income's coming in and my bank balance is increasing quite a bit. And so if we're not careful in terms of how we structure this, what is initially being intended, rightly so, as a bailout for working people, could end up in practice mean funneling lots of money upwards to asset owners. And if you think about it, none of this should really be surprising because we live under an economic system just now that delivers unequal outcomes by design. And so pushing more money through the system, getting the Bank of England to create all this money and pumping it through the system will inevitably mean that it will flow up to the top. And given the scale of the numbers involved, this is potentially very significant. And so in addition to the income measures, which are absolutely key, and we should power relations, that change the balance of power. And that's why I think we also need to be talking about things like whether it's rent freezes, debt cancellations, scaling up sort of decommodified, free at the point of use public services, and also things like wealth taxes as well, so that we make sure that those are the broadest shoulders actually contribute, rather than, as I said, in many cases, seeing the bank balances increase. So regardless of the specific solutions, which I think there's a big debate to be had on, and we should be having this discussion, the key lesson, I think, is that if we pump money into the system without changing the power relations, we'll only see the inequalities that we already see get worse. And I think in many ways we made this mistake at the last financial crisis a decade ago, and so it's really important that we don't make it again.
Okay, thanks so much, Laurie. That was really, really interesting. And you can read the article that Laurie wrote on openDemocracy, which talks about some of these ideas in more detail, and sign the petition, which we are posting both links to both in the chat now. You mentioned recession there, and like sort of a question from me here is, how important do you think this, these sorts of policies around social security will be in a recession, and what the impacts we might see? Well, I mean, I think the measures around social security and the safety net are going to be absolutely key. I mean, we're potentially looking at here the biggest economic downturn since the Great Depression, even bigger potentially. We don't know yet, but it's massive. And unless we have measures which provide that floor, basically, that means that nobody can fall below this level. If we don't do that, then we will see widespread hardship. And as I say, if you look at the US, what's happened, you've seen for the past 3 weeks or so, each week, about 6 million extra people becoming unemployed. It's just unprecedented. And obviously the US barely has a social safety net at all. You're really going to end up with people who are in, very, very, very dire straits indeed. And so at times like this, it's absolutely essential that we do provide that safety net. Because if we don't, the long-term harm, this isn't just a short-term thing of having, people slip into destitution, lose their jobs, not have any income. The long-term harm of that can be very, very, very significant indeed, even if, in the best case scenario, in 6 months' time, we have a vaccine and, we can sort of open things up again. That has can cause deep scarring on societies. And so it's essential that we don't go down that route. Oh no, I was muted. Are there examples in other countries of people doing things differently to how they're being done here? I mean, you mentioned America there, but are there any other examples? Yeah, I mean, America is probably not an example I would use in a good light, but certainly we've seen in other countries, France, for example, talking about things like utility bills freezing, for example, rents being freezed elsewhere, things like that. It's also important when we talk about things like the job retention scheme that the UK government's introduced. The government will pay 80% of wages of furloughed workers. Again, it's important to think about the sort of balance of power here, because the UK workers' rights in the UK are relatively weak compared to elsewhere. And if you look at the difference between how this type of scheme has been introduced in Denmark compared to here, in Denmark, there's stronger conditions attached to that scheme that are conditional on companies not being able to just lay people off, basically. And so I think that while what we've seen in the UK is obviously to be welcomed in some regards, as long as it's introduced in this wider context of a relatively insecure labour market, as I say, still meaning that people have to pay extortionate amounts in rent, extortionate amounts in bills, etc., then it kind of offsets that impact quite a bit. And so I think Denmark's been a really interesting case study of where they've been really on the front foot here and leading by example. Interesting. And in terms of those power relations you talked about, I mean, what do you think we could do to change the power relation, those imbalances of power here for us?
Well, I think there's a whole range of things. I mentioned some of them very briefly. If we look at the main outgoings that people have, as I mentioned, often is housing, rent, mortgage payments, etc. in this country are extremely high. And at the moment, private renters are really still, potentially suffering quite significant hardship. We've seen banks offer mortgage holidays to homeowners, but we haven't really seen much in the way of help for renters. And so I think building a groundswell of support, demanding perhaps things like, rent freezes, but actually not just as a temporary thing, but actually, building this up into a much broader campaign around potentially measures to control rents longer term, I think is really, really important. Similarly, around debt, we've had a private debt, household debt issue in this country for a long, long time. Unsecured household debt has increased dramatically in recent years. And what we've seen at the moment now, when people's incomes are being squeezed, these debts, become really, really, really burdensome. And so I think we need to be having a discussion around how we can either cancel or significantly reduce debt for people who are struggling here. And I know there's various great organisations, Jubilee Debt Campaign being one, who are doing some great work on this as well. And finally, I think that we do also need to be talking about things like wealth taxes or something similar, because if we're not careful, because of the extraordinary steps that have been taken by the Treasury and also the Bank of England pumping this large amounts of money in, what we could well see, as I mentioned, is not only some people's bank balances rising, but also after this, another surge in asset prices and house prices and share prices, etc., just like we did after 2008, where sort of people were able to sweep in after the crisis fades, pick up things on the cheap, and then we have this big boom in asset prices again. And so we need to make sure that doesn't happen, and we also need to make sure that those who are able to gain from this, we're able to kind of claw some of that back. And I think a wealth tax is something that should definitely be in the discussion around that.
Amazing. Thanks, Laurie. And thank you so much for joining us this evening. It's also like you've been reading our minds, because this week's podcast, which will be out tomorrow, is going to be on housing, renting, rent freezes, homelessness, all the things you talked about. And next week's briefing is also about all of those things. So you're a mind reader. So now, just before we move on to our final speaker, I just wanted to shout out to all the NEF supporters on the call this evening. Your generosity helps fund some of the exciting ideas we've heard on this call so far, not to mention supporting us to spread the word in briefings like this one. So thank you very much. If you are not a NEF supporter and you want to become one, then check out the donate page on our website, which we are posting the link to in the chat right now. Right, so next we are going to hear from our final speaker, Head of Rights, International Social and Economics at the TUC, Kate Bell. Kate, thanks for joining us. Are you there?
Can you hear me?
I can hear you. So thanks so much for joining us. The TUC has worked closely with the government on their job retention scheme. Could you talk to us a little bit about how those demands were won and how we could take these lessons into pushing for further changes?
Sure. So just first to say thanks so much for having me. It's been really nice to get the chance to listen to Laurie and Sarah as well. It's been really, really interesting. Just to say really quickly before I start, for anyone who doesn't know what the TUC is, we're the umbrella body representing the UK's trade unions. We represent 48 unions and over 5 million workers, and we exist to make the working world a better place for everyone. And if you are thinking, is there one thing I can do to support progressive change during this crisis? Join a union. You can find out which one on the TUC's website, which has got a really obvious website address, tuc.org.uk. So to actually answer your question, Sophie, what happened with the job retention scheme? So as Laurie and Sarah have said, that's the scheme which supports 80% of wages up to a monthly limit of £2,500. And that was mirrored by a support system for the self-employed, which broadly does the same thing, although with some notable exemptions, which we can talk about later if you like. So I think it's worth saying that when we started campaigning for this is not a normal bit of campaigning, basically. So I'm going to talk through kind of what happened and think a little bit about what some of the lessons might be. But it was definitely unusual, basically. So when the scale of kind of the coronavirus hit and the impact started to become a bit clearer in the UK, our first focus was actually on sick pay. We were hearing about the 2 million people who are excluded from sick pay, the ridiculously low level of sick pay, just £94 a week. And that was the first thing. When people were kind of being told to stay at home, when it was clear more people would be told to stay at home, that was the first thing we pushed for. But quite quickly, and it was after kind of the government announced some measures for business in the budget to support them during a time of kind of economic contraction, like Laurie's been talking about, we realised, well, there's nothing here to support workers' wages. We were also looking at what was happening across Europe. Laurie talked about the Danish scheme, for example, and these kind of wage subsidy schemes. That Danish scheme actually has already been in place for a really long time. The government was just able to expand it in the crisis. So pretty quickly in kind of public things we were saying, select committee, hearings, anytime we were on the news, we started saying, well, government needs to announce a wage subsidy scheme. That's what needed to protect people during the crisis. We pulled together some of that evidence into a report. We published that at the beginning of the week, which ended on the 20th. And by the end of the week, the Chancellor had announced this scheme. So, as I say, that is not normally what happens when the TUC calls for progressive change. You know, we had some pretty intensive discussions with the Treasury during that week. I think it's fair to say, or, you know, it's important to say that we weren't negotiating the scheme. You know, this wasn't the trade union negotiation where we can't go in and say, well, we'll walk out if you don't do this. This was us having conversations and saying, this is what we want you to do. And then obviously listening to a certain extent to what we were proposing. So, you know, this might be a one-off. This is a pretty exceptional circumstance, but I've tried to think through a little bit what some of the lessons for campaigning might be on that and how we could apply those to social security. So, kind of things I came up with when trying to think through that question. Well, we had a really clear idea of what the problem was that we were trying to solve. Businesses were letting go of their staff very, very quickly, and there was a very urgent need for intervention. I think that was obvious to everybody and was obvious to people across the economy. So we were solving a really clearly defined problem. Secondly, we had a pretty clear solution, subsidised workers' wages, and it wasn't only a clear solution, it was one that we'd seen work elsewhere. So we were able to say, look at the Danish system, look at the Austrian system, that works slightly different, look at kind of the system in Finland, and to say, we know these kind of systems work, they're tried and tested, you can do this quickly. We also had a bit of consensus, quite surprisingly, I think some of the business, well, maybe not surprisingly, perhaps thinking through a little bit what Laurie was saying, the business organisations were also supporting this, basically. So this wasn't an argument we were really having to make against something. We were kind of, you know, what we were fighting against was kind of either inertia or the idea that, you know, can we really do this? We've never done this before. Possibly, you know, a sense of kind of long-term kind of ideology around, do you intervene in the labour market? But actually we had a wide range of voices saying, actually, this is completely necessary. And then one thing I've been thinking about a little bit in terms of why this was successful, and I think maybe the most relevant lesson for campaigning on social security, is this was a plan for recovery, not just a plan for crisis. So one of the key things in our messaging was to say, we need this to protect people now, and we need it to make sure that we can protect people's ability to bounce back when this crisis is over. Now, in saying that, I don't want to say that we want to go back to things as they were when the crisis is over. You know, this wasn't a message of just keep everything ticking along, you know, our existing labour market works fine and we just need to make sure we can return to it. That's never been a TUC's message, and it wasn't now. But we've been thinking quite a lot in when we communicate around positive messaging and giving people things that don't just say, this is a terrible problem, but say, this is something which will make things better. And it was really important that we were saying this doesn't only make things better in the crisis, it makes things better in the long term too. So I've been trying to think kind of in preparation for this, what does this mean for how we campaign on social security? Well, our key ask at the TUC is very similar to that at NEF. We've asked for a big increase in the basic amount of universal credit. So we've suggested increasing it to £260 a week. That's 80% of the real living wage. That is a pretty big ask. We estimate it would cost about £15 billion over 3 months. But as Sarah reminded us, 34 billion has been taken out of the social security system since 2010. And so, you know, we're asking, it's big in terms of kind of government interventions, but it's not big in terms of the amount of money that has been taken away from the people who need it most. And I think one of the reasons we framed it like that, as that kind of 80% of average wages, is because we want that strategic shift to what looks more like a system that you see across most of Europe, where people's incomes are protected when they fall out of work, basically. So at the moment, the level of social security you get, so that basic £94 a week, as Sarah was saying, is probably about 19% of average wages. So that's a pretty big income hit. And we think it's really important that you have a scheme which actually cushions people's income when they come out of work. So how much have we managed to apply what I kind of thought were the lessons from the job retention scheme in trying to present this? So I think we have got a pretty good idea of the problem. As Sarah and Laurie just said, we're expecting, even with the job retention scheme in place, a pretty significant increase in unemployment. And we know we need to do something about the fact that those unemployed people are going to face a social security system which does not give them enough to live on. I think we've got a clearish solution. The complexity of the universal credit system that's in place makes this harder. So in the report that we've produced, we've called for a range of associated changes. So we've said government needs to lift the benefit cap, which is a totally appalling policy, which basically says you can only receive a certain amount of social security support. We've talked about that 5-week wait that Sarah mentioned. We've talked about a freeze on council tax. We've talked about some other kind of relatively technical changes to the social security system that we think would be needed to make this work. But I think our core message is pretty clear. It's a big increase in the basic amount of social security. Do we have consensus? I think we do have basic consensus, at least amongst the organisations on this call. Some kind of differences in how we've presented that, in how unconditional it is. But I think everyone, and there's a wide range of consensus that the basic level of social security needs to be higher, which is, I think, what we're all pushing for as a long-term solution as well as a short-term solution. We perhaps have less of a consensus across kind of unusual suspects. I have not yet seen any business organisations call for a higher level of social security. And I think in terms of kind of campaigning going forward, one of the things we might want to think about is, how do we make this kind of common sense, not only amongst progressive organisations, but amongst a kind of wider group of people? And then what about that kind of lesson about kind of framing it as something positive? Well, I think kind of reflecting on this, and thanks for this call because it's given me an opportunity to do that. Maybe we haven't done such a good job of that so far, because too often we're presenting this as, there is a crisis, it's going to be awful, we need to make it slightly less awful. I think we all know that social security is actually a recovery mechanism too. If people don't experience that kind of income crash, then they're better protected, they're better able to, carry on paying their bills, their mental health stays better, their ability to find a job in the future stays better. But I think one of the things we need to do is present this kind of social security package not only as a kind of crisis mechanism but as a recovery mechanism too, and that's something we're going to be thinking about. So I'd really love to kind of hear any input maybe in the questions about how you think we can pitch this as something that's kind of not just something that's desperately needed because of our threadbare social security system and because of what looks like, a terrifying increase in unemployment, but as something that is a positive intervention which makes us healthier, safer into the future, and again helps with that recovery, which is really important. And I'll stop there.
Great, thanks so much, Kate. If you out there want more resources on what Kate has talked about this evening, you should check out the TUC report that called for wage subsidies, their report on social security and sick pay, and the piece on openDemocracy. We are posting links to all of these things apparently in the chat. I'm not doing it, I hope that's true. So we've had a couple of follow-up questions. I was just thinking, you talked about some of the people that felt, that were missed out by the job retention scheme and some of the gaps. So in your sort of dealings with the government, maybe you learned some lessons about where they are on economics and where they are on social security, and sort of like, is there anything you can sort of draw on from that? And in terms of that, are there any practical sort of proposals for campaigning on sort of raising UC and minimum income, what we talked about? I mean, you touched on it a little bit at the end there, but sort of like reflecting on where you think the government might be at and where they might be going, and sort of like how we can like bed that into our campaigning going forward.
Sure. So on the kind of gaps, one thing that actually has been positive about our interaction with government, and we are not someone who gives them praise easily, is they have actually responded to the gaps being pointed out. So they have clarified that 0 hours contract workers should absolutely be covered. They've clarified that more contingent workers should be covered, and the self-employment income support scheme, not perfect, but was introduced after pressure. A change that came out yesterday was they've brought forward or sort of more people can be included, because the cut-off date is now the 19th of March, not the 28th of February. So I think kind of what we learned from that experience, and they're responsive to that, is when they put a scheme in place, they want it to work. Basically, they want it to work, they want it to be seen as successful. And I think one thing probably we've learned that they're concerned about is that kind of, elusive thing which gets talked about in kind of the economy a lot and in some kind of ridiculous ways, but around confidence. We have been saying people need to have confidence in this scheme, and to do that, it needs to be comprehensive. People need to know they can access it, and it needs to cover everybody. So I think one thing we've kind of learned about this is that they want schemes that kind of are seen to work. And I think that point I was making about they want schemes that do not feel like we are going to be kind of in a terrible situation forever, but schemes which can be presented both as a kind of plan for now, but a plan for recovery, has also been really important. It just, if you look at some of the kind of rhetoric around announcing it. So I think that's kind of the key message I've taken from this, as our plan for social security as well. And I think this is going to sound really awful, but I think one of the kind of campaigning opportunities we've got on social security is, unfortunately, many, many more people are coming into contact with the social security system than have done for a long, long time. For those kind of long-term veterans of campaigning on social security, it's always been presented as something kind of for other people, as something for people who, don't really want a job, who are somehow different from us, who are a massively stigmatised group. There's been a huge amount of stigma around the social security system. I think, unfortunately, and you don't want this to be the reason this is the case, because more people are coming into contact with it, it is an opportunity to remind people that this is a system that's there for everybody. It's a safety net. It's our collective responsibility to each other. It's how we support each other. And it's something that is absolutely designed to get you back on your feet, to help you survive a crisis and to help you recover, not a kind of residual, you're a different type of person who doesn't want a job, and you're over in this system where we resentfully throw you a few pennies. And I think it's totally vital we use this moment to kind of reframe our debate about social security as something that's there for everybody, as the original design of our, post-Second World War system absolutely did.
Yeah, another question in the chat here from John is, in the long term, who will pick up the bill from the job retention scheme and, by extension, self-employment scheme?
Well, one of the things, I guess, this really touches on the issues Laurie was raising, I think, in terms of how do we kind of, and I think Sarah was raising these too, how do we make the argument about, government is taking on significant amounts of public debt in order to fund these schemes, and rightly so, and at historically low levels of borrowing costs. How do we make sure, and you've already got people kind of going out there and arguing, we're going to need a big bout of austerity to combat this. I think you've seen George Osborne making some of those arguments, because apparently he only has one argument. So I think there is, it's really important that we say, the experience of previous crisis responses, like wartime, is the best way to respond to these is to grow the economy. That's why these schemes are so important now, is so that we can recover. We grow the economy, we get the economy working effectively, and that's how we make sure that people are able to pay their taxes, at which point we do, of course, as Laurie says, need to be looking at how we have a fair tax system. I think wealth tax is massively going up the political agenda. I think one of the other things that kind of has become evident in this crisis, if it wasn't evident before, is who genuinely creates value in the economy. We've looked at totally heroic efforts of very, very underpaid workers. And I think never before has it been more visible that who is paying and who is earning is just kind of wrong in this country. And I think that is an opportunity to kind of reset our debate around kind of the type of taxation system we have, as well as avoiding that kind of rush into, well, workers benefited for this, so they better pay for it in the long term too.
Brilliant, thanks so much, Kate. And And thanks again for joining us this evening. It has been a wonderful and informative time for everybody. We very much appreciate all of you coming and joining us and all of our speakers today. That's nearly all we've got time for on the call this evening. So yes, once again, thank you for coming. Just a reminder that you can sign up already to next week's briefing on coronavirus, renters and homelessness right now. We did have a little technical glitch on this week's Zoom, which meant that we got to capacity. We promised that was a mistake, and next week there will be capacity for everyone, so don't worry. And we are obviously doing a recording of this, so if you've joined us at the end of this, we will put up a recording so you can watch the whole thing back. If you're not on our mailing list, then you can sign up to be the first to hear about briefings like this by scrolling to the bottom of the page on our website, filling out the form. This is where you'll also find the recording of this week's briefing, along with all the links we've shared in the chat. We're posting links to both this and next week's briefing in the chat right now. And we had quite a lot of questions after Sarah finished speaking about the ins and outs of the minimum income guarantee. Do check out our website. There's loads of information on there, including a full briefing. We've got a link to the podcast where Sarah has gone through all of the details of minimum income guarantee, and Neff's sort of like detailed plans for that, and where we've got all of our figures from. And if you check out Sarah's page on our website, you'll see all the blogs she's written about it. And we are going to let you go a little bit earlier tonight so you can go and get a cup of tea before we have to go outside and clap for our carers. So thanks very much for joining us. And thanks to all the speakers once again. I'm going to clap you because, why not? Thanks, everybody. I hope you enjoyed yourselves.